Opening the flank, this move immediately stakes a claim on the d5 square and prepares to challenge black's central ambitions. Developing the knight to its most active square prepares for pawn advances and central control, embracing flexibility. Developing a piece to a central square, aiming to control more territory and prepare for d4. Preparing a fianchetto, this pawn advance grants the bishop an expansive diagonal, setting the stage for dynamic interplay. Establishing central pawn presence solidifies early control and opens diagonals for pieces, a fundamental step in many English opening systems. Developing the bishop to its fianchettoed square solidifies the queenside and prepares for pawn advances on the central squares. Developing the kingside fianchetto solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling, creating a harmonious pawn-piece battery. Securing the king's safety in the flank opening sets a solid foundation for future middle-game struggles. Fortifying the kingside and preparing to unleash the dark-squared bishop's power. Solidifying the center and preparing a potential e5 pawn thrust, this move champions a robust pawn chain. Establishing central control with the knight, white prepares to support the e4 advance and potentially challenge black's fianchettoed bishop, while also contributing to a flexible pawn structure that can adapt to various middle-game scenarios. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential pawn advances or pressure on the queenside, gracefully coordinating pieces towards central influence. Castling kingside solidifies white's monarch, a crucial step in preparing for the central maneuvering that's sure to follow, and it frees the rook to join the fight on the d or e file. Preparing a pawn lever on the queenside, a6 signals an intent to expand and potentially challenge white's central grip, while also securing the b5 square from future knight advances, and perhaps paving the way for a well-timed b5 push later. A prophylactic measure, safeguarding the kingside from any potential bh3 infiltration and simultaneously preparing a potential kingside pawn storm down the h-file, though it concedes valuable tempi. Preparing for a queenside expansion, the rook anchors itself on the b-file, subtly eyeing potential pawn advances like b5, while simultaneously defending the d6 pawn against any knight repositioning. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this piece now eyes the queenside and prepares to support future pawn advances. Challenging the queenside immediately, black aims to disrupt white's intended kingside expansion and potentially open lines for counterplay, creating a dynamic imbalance. Opening the c-file creates immediate pressure, forcing black to address the pawn disparity or risk losing material. It's a calculated risk to disrupt black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the pawn exchange, and tests black's resolve to defend their compromised pawn structure. Opening up the file for the rook immediately creates immediate tactical possibilities, though it does leave the b5 pawn somewhat exposed. Black is clearly aiming to contest the semi-open file and potentially target white's queenside structure later. This pawn break is a double-edged sword, injecting dynamism, but requiring careful follow-up to secure the newfound activity. Pushing the pawn to d5 seizes the central initiative and forces black to confront a now imposing pawn chain, potentially restricting their piece mobility and forcing a positional decision that could define the game's character. Shifting the knight to the rim, na5, aims to exploit the g3 pawn's forward position by threatening a quick infiltration along the a5-e1 diagonal should the d-pawn advance further or a central break occur, while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain outpost opportunities on c4. Initiating a bold queenside expansion, the thrust of b4 aims to shatter black's central pawn structure and seize significant territory, forcing a decisive confrontation on the flank. Pouncing on the weakened light squares, black's knight establishes a formidable outpost, creating a positional thorn that white will struggle to dislodge, while simultaneously threatening to unravel white's pawn structure on the queenside. Instantly, white creates a significant positional imbalance by banishing black's bishop from its commanding diagonal and forcing it to a less influential square. This maneuver aims to restrict black's queenside activity, particularly the potent diagonal that the fianchettoed bishop typically controls. Observe how the pawn chain on d5 now gains more breathing room, while white's own pieces are poised to exploit the weakened central squares if black isn't careful with their next few steps. The long-term goal here is to solidify white's central control and prepare for a potential kingside expansion, all while making black's queenside pieces work harder to find harmonious positions. Immediately repositioning the rook to b7 initiates a strategic redeployment, aiming to contest the open a file and simultaneously bolster the kingside defenses against any potential incursions by white's bishop or knight. This maneuver subtly seeks to stabilize black's pawn structure while preparing for a more active role in the queenside skirmish that has been brewing since white's pawn push on d5. Opening a new avenue for the bishop, white aims to dislodge the strong knight on c4, potentially preparing a kingside pawn storm or reinforcing the center. Black immediately seizes the central initiative, challenging white's pawn chain and opening lines for their pieces. Exploiting the open d-file, white forces a pawn exchange that aims to disrupt black's central control and potentially open lines toward their castled king. Embracing the doubled pawns is a bold step, opening lines towards your monarch that will demand careful defensive attention from now on, while also potentially creating weaknesses in white's structure on the kingside. Disrupting black's harmonious pawn structure by exchanging the bishop for the knight is a key strategic decision, aiming to create weaknesses in the dark squares surrounding the king. This tactical exchange fundamentally alters the pawn mass and could pave the way for increased piece activity for white on the kingside. Recapturing with the queen solidifies the center and activates this vital piece, though it does open lines towards the castled king for potential future threats. Sharpening the central pressure, white readies a potent assault along the c-file, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's monarch and potentially split the queenside pawns. Igniting the center with a pawn thrust, black dramatically alters the strategic landscape, forcing a confrontation and potentially opening lines that were previously dormant. This bold pawn advance aims to seize the initiative, challenging white's central control and creating immediate tactical possibilities. But it also weakens the pawn chain and could leave black's king slightly more exposed should white react precisely. Securing the center, this move reinforces d5, aiming to create a solid pawn structure and preventing immediate knight infiltration by black's nc6. A crucial repositioning of the queen, aiming to avoid the impending pawn thrust on d5 and seeking more active squares on the kingside, while also preparing for potential counterplay involving the now exposed d-file. Unleashing a knight from its defensive post, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and initiate an offensive push on the queenside by potentially exploiting the weakened pawn structure. Securing the b4 pawn appears tempting, yet it steers the queen into a precarious, exposed position, potentially sacrificing tempo and opening avenues for white's initiative. Initiating a dynamic counterpressure along the queenside, this move skillfully repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and preparing for future central action. Liberating the c5 square allows the queen to exert pressure on the queenside and potentially support a central pawn push, while simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable white knight on d4. Shifting the knight to the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's well-established pawn structure and create new attacking avenues on that flank, while simultaneously defending the sensitive c3 square. Embracing the offered pawn exchange seems like a pragmatic choice, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit the slight awkwardness of white's queen. This maneuver frees up your pieces and prepares for a more active role, perhaps by eyeing the kingside or reinforcing the center. Recapturing the pawn is essential, and redeploying the knight to this central square aims to solidify control over the d5 pawn and prepare for potential advances or defensive maneuvers, while simultaneously looking to disrupt black's pawn structure. Re-establishing the queen on c5 offers respite, forcing the knight back, but it also signifies a willingness to enter a position where white's queenside has significantly more dynamic potential, especially with the bishop pair poised for activity. Initiating pawn pushes on the queen side to disrupt black's compact structure, aiming to create weaknesses and potentially open lines for piece activity. Clearing the d-file offers a temporary respite, but the pawn chain on the queen side is irrevocably fractured, potentially opening lines for white's rooks to infiltrate. Seizing the open knight file offers a dynamic avenue for white's rook, aiming to disrupt black's central structure and potentially create attacking opportunities on the king side by leveraging the weakened pawns. Re-establishing a healthy pawn chain while challenging white's central control and preparing to activate the queenside pieces represents a fundamental shift in black's approach after white's pawn grab. The knight's journey to the queenside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Shifting the king to the 8th rank, a seemingly passive maneuver, crucially prepares for potential action on the g-file, either defensively to bolster the kingside pawn structure or offensively to support a rook advance, while simultaneously avoiding any immediate tactical threats that might arise from the advanced white queenside pawns. A deliberate repositioning, this knight embarks on a journey to reinforce the queenside and potentially support a central pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's active piece play and secure a more comfortable structure after the recent exchanges. The rook invades the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create counterplay by targeting the advanced b-pawn. This aggressive positioning forces white to defend directly, potentially diverting their attention from central control or attacking opportunities. Securing the knight's outpost on c3 aims to solidify control over this central square, preparing for potential advances, or simply preventing black's pieces from occupying it. Activating the bishop to an outpost on a6 fundamentally reshapes the battlefield, not just by offering a new attacking angle towards white's kingside, but also by contesting the crucial b5 square, which was recently surrendered. This repositioning potentially sets up a future skirmish along the a-file, aiming to pry open lines that could eventually threaten the white monarch indirectly or provide a vital escape route for black's own queen. Consider the geometric implications. This bishop now eyes squares that were previously inaccessible, and its presence on a6 creates a subtle yet significant spatial dilemma for white's pieces, forcing them to constantly be aware of its latent power. A bold maneuver aiming to dislodge the aggressive bishop and potentially exploit the open, a file for a counterattack, though it grants black a more comfortable maneuvering space for their pieces on the queen side. Unleashing the rook along the 2nd rank, black injects a potent threat, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially infiltrate the 7th rank, forcing a reactive stance. Rallying the rook to the open file signifies a renewed focus on controlling the crucial central pathway, aiming to disrupt black's recently established coordination and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around their king or pawn structure. Bouncing the rook back to the open file signifies a desperate attempt to salvage some activity and potentially tie down white's pieces, though it feels like a concession of space and a reliance on counterplay that might not materialize against white's consolidated queenside. The rook transfer to the 6th rank immediately injects immense pressure, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside pawn structure and the exposed black king. Embracing the chaos, you've traded your queen for a rook and a bishop, sacrificing tempo for material in a bold gambit that promises dynamic counterplay. The queenside is now a labyrinth of tactics, and your king, though seemingly safe for now, resides in a territory ripe for exploration by white's remaining pieces. The subsequent action hinges on your ability to weave a complex web of threats, leveraging the material advantage to compensate for the positional concessions. Unleashing a tactical bolt, white sacrifices the knight to rip open the dark squares around black's king, seeking to exploit the weakened kingside and the awkwardly placed queen. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to disrupt the white queen's harmony, this capture ignites a complex positional struggle where material equality is secondary to control of open lines and piece activity. Suddenly, the d-file becomes a battlefield, and black's king feels a bit less secure amidst the open board. The bishop's exchange on d5 injects immediate tactical complexity, reopening the central d-file for potential white pressure and creating a dynamic pawn structure where black's isolated d-pawn now becomes a target, demanding careful defensive coordination. Suddenly, black's king feels alarmingly exposed as this rook infiltrates the 7th rank, disrupting white's established defense and threatening a cascade of potential tactics. Seizing the initiative on the open d-file, this capture immediately eliminates black's last pawn shield and opens lines leading directly to the king, creating significant attacking potential for white. Sacrificing the queen to eliminate white's threatening bishop and pawn chain is a bold gambit, aiming to untangle black's position and create counterplay with active minor pieces in the resulting simplified, yet imbalanced, scenario. The capture of the rook decisively simplifies the position and leads towards a winning endgame for white, leveraging the exposed black king and the superior activity of white's remaining pieces. Unleashing the rook into white's weakened kingside, this aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and exploit the newfound open files. Unlocking the d-file after the material swap, white aims to exploit the lingering weakness around black's king and potentially prepare a pawn push on the queen side. Initiating a dangerous pawn storm on the queen side now, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated structure and create active counterplay before the inevitable exchanges simplify the position further. The rook captures, finally resolving the material imbalance and transitioning towards an endgame where white will have a significant pawn advantage. The bishop's return to the queen side after being forced back signifies a desperate attempt to find any sort of counterplay in this completely lost position. While the pawn on a4 is now defended, the material deficit is insurmountable, and the exposed king offers no solace for a comeback. Black's pieces are largely passive, lacking any coordinated attack, and white's connected passed pawns on the kingside will inevitably decide the game. This final bishop maneuver is a testament to the difficulty of finding worthwhile moves when facing such a decisive disadvantage. The immediate need for the white king is a secure haven, and this king's walk aims to find that safety behind the remaining pawns, a crucial step in preparing for the simplified endgame. Unleashing a passed pawn now forces white to decide whether to push the pawn or allow black's new central threat to gain momentum. The monarch now ventures into the thick of the fray, seeking active participation rather than remaining a passive spectator behind diminished pawn structures. The rook's infiltration along the 4th rank, though seemingly passive, disrupts white's pawn structure and aims to create a threat on the queenside should the king be forced to abandon its central protection. Anchoring the bishop on this central square immediately presents black with a difficult decision regarding their rook's safety. Securing the king's safety is paramount now, as the monarch ventures closer to the skirmish line, potentially becoming a target for opposing forces. Finally, the knight finds a more active posting on f4, eyeing potential breakthroughs and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure, particularly the isolated c5 pawn. A desperate attempt to unleash the passed pawn, though its advancement offers little immediate solace given the rook's superior control of the critical central files. Reactivating the knight from its somewhat passive post on f4 allows for a more dynamic defense against black's encroaching queenside pawns and aims to exploit the open c-file for potential counterplay. The bishop now repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to exert pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially support an advance of the c-pawn. Pushing the g-pawn further now aims to exploit the weakened kingside dark squares, potentially creating mating threats or opening lines for the bishop and knight to penetrate black's position. The bishop retreats, surveying the complex interplay of pieces, seeking a more active posting amidst the tangled pawns and the looming threat of the white king's advance. Securing the central squares with this knight offers a solid defensive foundation, preventing any immediate breakthrough attempts by black's pieces and preparing for a potential kingside advance later in the game. Baffling decision. Plunging the rook into enemy territory without support after the queen's sacrifice is a desperate gamble that leaves it stranded and vulnerable. Activating the knight to the edge of the board often signals a desire to reroute it to a more active square or support a pawn push. Reactivating the rook on the d-file offers potential for creating dynamic play, but one must be wary of the doubled pawns on the c-file, which could become a weakness if white manages to fix them. Unleashing pawns forward, white initiates a dramatic pawn storm, aiming to pierce the black king's defenses and create past threats in this increasingly sharp endgame. Unleashing a pawn surge offers a dynamic path towards disrupting white's defensive structure and potentially creating passball threats down the c-file. The king, having been a passive observer, now cautiously steps back towards the action, a prudent maneuver to sidestep immediate threats while maintaining defensive options as the pawn storm intensifies on the king side. The bishop's journey to d6 seems to aim at solidifying the pawn chain and potentially offering some support for the remaining pieces, a measured response as the material becomes more balanced. Activating the knight to a central outpost, the knight on c2 prepares to join the kingside pawn storm and pressure black's isolated queen's pawn. A bold attempt to create counterplay by creating a passed pawn, but it weakens the king's defenses significantly. The knight repositioning to d4 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open g-file once the g4 pawn advances further. The pawn push opens a diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit the now potentially exposed king should the bishop retreat. The pawn advances, finally opening a diagonal for the bishop and creating a potential passed pawn on the h-file, aiming to exploit the exposed king. The bishop now retreats, seeking to anchor itself on a square where it can influence the central pawn structure and potentially create threats against white's exposed king, aiming to improve its scope after the recent exchange of queens. Putting the king on the g3 square initiates a potential defensive maneuver, bringing the monarch closer to the action and possibly preparing for a later advance into the center. Unveiling the bishop to force a reaction from the white king, aiming to exploit any slight opening and potentially gain a tempo for repositioning or advancing pawns. Igniting the kingside pawn storm offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt black's entrenched defensive structure and potentially create mating threats. The king, now unburdened by its royal duties on the first rank, embarks on a brave journey across the board, seeking safer pastures and potentially becoming an active participant in the pawn battle unfolding on the kingside. Reactivating the monarch, the king ventures forward, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame, a testament to the ever-changing landscape of the chessboard where even the royal piece can become a dynamic force. Black's bishop repositions, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the c-file later. Refocusing the knight to c2 initiates a patient regrouping, aiming to establish a stronger defensive presence on the queenside and potentially prepare a later advance of the g-pawn, while simultaneously considering a potential shuttle to b4 for more active play if circumstances allow.